Hello and welcome to the Danielle Newnham podcast, where I interview tech founders and innovators to learn the inspiring human stories behind their game-changing work. Today's guest is theoretical computer scientist Leslie Valiant, currently the T. Jefferson Coolidge Professor of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at Harvard University. Among his many accolades, Leslie was awarded the Turing Award in 2010 for transformative contributions to the theory of computation, including the theory of PAC learning, which stands for probably approximately correct, as well as the complexity of enumeration and of algebraic computation, and the theory of parallel and distributed computing. In this episode, Leslie and I discuss his life and career journey, from what problems he has looked to solve in his career, to how his PAC theory was first received, and we talk about his latest book, The Importance of Being Educable. But before we get started, here's a quick ad from this week's sponsor. Have you ever wondered what your digital footprint says about you, or curious about how you can make your pitch stand out? Then check out whitebridge.ai. It's an AI-powered digital identity research tool that finds, verifies, and analyzes publicly collected data about someone and structures it into an insightful report. They actually ran a report on me, and I have to say I was seriously impressed. But not only can you use it to check out your online digital profile, but you could use it to help you quickly research and understand other people, whether it's a potential client, employee, or investor. The report gives you more than enough useful information on the person for you to truly personalize your correspondence to them and help you build that early rapport. If you want to learn more, head to whitebridge.ai and use my discount code Danielle30, that's DANIELLE 30, for 30% off your first report. Now, back to my conversation with Leslie Valiant. Leslie, thank you so much for joining me today. I always like to start with people's childhoods because I think it adds context to who you are. So I want to ask you, what were you like as a child, and what do you think some childhood experiences are that shaped you?
Well, thank you for inviting me. Yes, I was interested in science from a early age, maybe already at 9 or 10. I think I was very interested. So in the end, I finished up more like a pure science person than an engineer. But in fact, my childhood, I was interested in tinkering around. And so one thing I've reflected on and tried to research is, so in the late 50s, transistors became available, and one could go to a store in some suburban high street and buy transistors and resistors. And even a child like me at the age of about 9 could assemble a transistor radio, which was kind of very exciting at the time. I remember when I could first hear the music on the BBC Live program, I think. And of course, as a child, one's got no idea how recent all these developments had been. So the transistor had been invented maybe 10, 11 years earlier. But already one could buy these little components for a few pence and assemble them yourself, twisting the wires together, and you were part of this great new technology without realizing it. So I think that was a special time in the late 50s when a child could somehow enter the modern era in this way.
Absolutely. It was a very exciting time. I'm guessing you were influenced by your father, who was a chemical engineer. And I've heard that you were kind of left to your own devices and even tried to make a rocket ship, which must have been an interesting event for your parents to see. I'm guessing it didn't quite get to the destination you'd hoped it for, because wasn't it meant to go around the world, I think, was your idea?
So you're well informed, yes. Yes, it didn't quite make it, no. But I enjoyed thinking about it, and also doing a few small experiments which also didn't quite work. But yeah, so I think at the time I was also interested in physics and making calculations about what it would take to make a rocket to go around the world, that kind of thing. So both the reality of tinkering and the calculations together, I think, what got me excited.
I'm sure. And what was your first experience of a computer? When did you first come across computers?
So actually, I remember in the late 50s even, these sheets one got off circuits for putting together your transistors with. The last page was usually something to do with a computer, but it just needed too many components, and I wasn't interested. But then so before university, I spent a few months working in a medical physics lab in London. And in the last 2 weeks there, I was introduced to this machine where you had to program it, write the program on this green tape with holes in. And I think I wrote a few little programs to do correlations and things like that. So I was 18 by then. So I was introduced 2 short weeks in a summer job kind of thing.
It's amazing what 2 short weeks, how it can impact you. So I know that you received a degree in mathematics from King's College, Cambridge. Then you did a diploma in computer science at Imperial College, London. And then you completed a PhD in computer science at Warwick. Your thesis was around decision procedures for families of deterministic pushdown automata. What prompted you to tackle this topic, and how did it lead to your subsequent work?
Well, probably the most critical decision actually was to go to Warwick to do a PhD in computer science. So when I was at Imperial, I didn't quite know what to do next, and I wanted to do a PhD, but I didn't know what in. So I took this seriously. I went to the library, read various papers by people who were working in Britain at the time in computer science. And I came across this paper by this person, Mike Patterson, who became my supervisor at Warwick. And so this paper was on very tangible examples of problems which are not computable. So this is following on the work of Turing. And so this really inspired me as being something very different. So in Cambridge, I did a lot of mathematics and applied mathematics, some physics. But this Turing idea of something not being computable is really a result about intellectual possibilities. So he proved that certain things just cannot be calculated systematically. So this, I think, reading this paper was decisive on me deciding to on the direction I wanted to take in computer science. I went to Warwick, became a student of Mike Patterson, and so this problem was a problem of whether a certain question you could write a computer program for, or whether, in the sense of Turing, it was forever non-computable. So it was one of these very simple questions. Well, simple if you spend little time trying to define it, but where it wasn't clear at all whether a computer could solve it in all cases or whether it couldn't. So I think this was a good way of starting research, because it was a difficult problem. I didn't actually solve it in general, but it gave me a good idea of what a difficult problem was.
Actually, I had a question further along that I wanted to ask you, but I'll ask it now. I wanted to ask you, what ingredients does a problem need to have to make it an interesting problem for you to work on?
Okay, well, that's the fundamental question for a researcher, right? Is how one chooses one's problems. Okay, I think it's very hard to make it explicit. The kind of problems I've worked on kind of both had some mathematical content, but also related to something in the real world. So cognition, how humans think, is a real world phenomenon, and the approaches I take are usually where some mathematical formulation helps. And in trying to solve these problems, you get some intrusions from the real world, but in the end, manipulating symbols on a sheet of paper also helps, because it takes you in directions which your intuition wouldn't have taken you. So in answer to your question, it's problems which have some relation to some real phenomenon, some natural phenomenon in the world, but where you expect the answer to have some mathematical content.
Absolutely. You mentioned Mike Patterson there. One of the questions also I want to ask you was about, what did you learn from Mike Patterson and David Park, if you had any dealings with him? They were both at Warwick. I'm assuming, was David Park there when you were there?
He was indeed, yeah. So David Park had been Mike Patterson's PhD supervisor, but they'd kind of diverged in their interest in computer science. So I've got very good memories of David Park, but I didn't work with him. So I certainly learned an enormous amount from Mike Patterson, who was a very generous supervisor, generous with his time, and so he's also a superb mathematician. So how to tackle a hard problem, I think I probably started learning from him.
In 1984, you wrote a paper called A Theory of the Learnable, which provided a mathematical foundation for describing how a computer could learn. And I think it's here where you introduced your probably approximately correct PAC model. I just wanted to ask you, this was obviously 1984. You were going down a kind of uncharted territory, which I've heard you say before, that this path really suited you. Can you tell me how the PAT model was received in 1984 and why you think going down an uncharted path like this was very suited to you?
Yeah, so I mean, on how it was received with everything, there's always a mixed reaction. So, but what was fortunate for me is that there were a few people who saw the point and took it up and took it and ran with it. So there was a small group of people who understood it, agreed with it, and wanted to work on it. So I think as far as why it, well, I think this particular problem, I think, suited me at the time. So probably several factors. So it's hard to just jump into a new area and do something if you've got no relevant background. So I did have a relevant background because I was studying computational complexity, which is about the difficulty, inherent difficulty of solving problems. So it's like a generalization of what Turing did. So Turing showed that some things you can't compute at all. Complexity is about how even among problems which are computable, some are easy and some are very hard to compute. So that was my background, and I suspected that human cognition, especially learning, was a problem which was limited by computation. That certain things were probably too hard to compute, and certain things were learnable, and they're the ones which could learn in practice. And understanding where the boundary was part of the secret. So I think what is involved is so this problem involved, I think, a real phenomenon. So you're right that the paper was partly about how machines could learn, but in fact, I didn't see it as that entirely. I also saw it as a paper about this natural phenomenon of how humans learn. And in fact, some of the papers I was reading around that time were papers by philosophers who had been looking at similar questions for a long time. So I think, given my interests and my background in complexity theory, I think this was just the right problem. It was to do with some natural phenomenon, and I thought it needed some more mathematical treatment.
Absolutely. As I keep saying, it was obviously ahead of its time. When I've spoken to other people like Dr. Bob Langer of Moderna, but also I've heard Jeffrey Hinton say the same, that sometimes when you're ahead of time, you can get kind of unwarranted criticism, or maybe it's warranted criticism, but you'll often have someone who'll critique the ideas that you're putting forward. If you were to give advice to researchers who might be working in fields that are at their infancy, what would that advice be in terms of dealing with any kind of criticism?
Well, you certainly have to be thick-skinned. Okay, that goes without saying, because if you come up with something new, I mean, you've just persuaded yourself to change your view of some question. So persuading other people may be difficult, and it's very difficult to shake people from their existing beliefs. So often, if you give a talk and you claim something very new, the room is very quiet. Because, I mean, no one's going to jump immediately agree with you, because everyone needs to think about it carefully. So I think the advice is simply to be patient. I mean, you have to follow your own beliefs and judgment. So if you think you have to judge your own work, kind of having an accurate judgment of the value of your work is important. So you obviously shouldn't overestimate it or underestimate it. You have to value it for what it's worth, and then pursue it accordingly. Being too sensitive to criticism is clearly slows you down.
You've written several books, including Circuits of the Brain, probably approximately correct, and your latest, The Importance of Being Educable. What, for those that don't know, is the thread that ties them all together?
Well, the thread is that human cognition is an amazing phenomenon, and somehow I expect that one can understand it, that every amazing phenomenon will be understandable scientifically, and that usually means that there's something simple to say which explains a big chunk of it. And so when one thinks about cognition, I think there are kind of two different directions. One is to explain, what is it that cognition realizes. So, for example, learning is one aspect of cognition. You can learn. You can try to pin that down, what it means to learn. If you have a box which claims to learn, what properties does it need to have? But this is independent of how it does it. And the second question is, if you want a box which does something, whether it's a brain or a computer, how could it be done in an actual computer? How might it be done in the brain? So the what and the how, the two aspects of trying to analyze what cognition is. And I think all these 3 books are about this.
And they're brilliant books, I should add. The idea of intelligence, I wanted to talk about that. I don't know about many others, but growing up in England in the 80s and 90s, I don't know if it was just the type of school that I went to, but we were regularly given IQ tests. And it didn't take me long before I realized that at the back of this particular book that we had were the answers. So I actually felt like I had passed the IQ test by finding the answers and being able to slip them in. But for those that are unsure, how would you define intelligence?
Well, how I start the most recent book is by criticizing the notion of intelligence. That in fact, I think it's a very unfortunate word. We use it all the time. We talk about artificial intelligence. We talk about intelligence quotient. But in fact, no one has defined it. There's a famous report of the American Psychological Association in the 90s, which tried to finally nail it down. What did science say about intelligence? And they concluded that, there's no agreement on that. And even that if you ask a dozen experts what they mean by intelligence, they disagree. So I think it's a very bad word, and it's slowed us down. The word hasn't helped AI develop. So actually in the American context, so one thing which is slightly indicative of this is, so here, the standardized tests are called SAT tests, and it used to stand for standardized aptitude test. And the question is, what does the middle A stand for? So after a while, they decided that the A doesn't really test for aptitude, maybe just an assessment. After a few years, they decided you shouldn't even count it as assessment. So now SAT doesn't stand for anything officially. Okay, so people do a test where they don't tell you what it's testing for. So it's a bit like you're going into a shop and buying ice cream, and the box just says that, after you eat this, you'll be less hungry than before, probably, but it doesn't tell you what's in the box. So I think it's unfortunate. Of course, the historical origins of the notion of intelligence tests, this goes back to Charles Spearman, early 1900s. So he observed that if you go to school, then the performance of children in different subjects varies. But on the average, some children do better than others on the average. So he hypothesized that the mystery ingredient which makes your average performance in school higher than someone else's is intelligence, this intelligence quotient. So something defined totally implicitly. So anyway, so in some sense, what my recent book is about, my current book, is trying to replace the notion of intelligence by something which is definable much more explicitly, which I call educability. For which there's a more explicit definition. You can specify what you expect an educable machine or person to do, and the aim is that you shouldn't be able to ask. The aim is that the answer to your question should be more explicit for educability than it is for intelligence.
Indeed. I wanted to ask you, talking about the book, The Importance of Being Educable, you say in the book that what allows us to create civilization and therefore what makes us unique is educability. So I wanted to ask you, can you define educability, and why write the book now? Why was it important to get this book out now? Or is it something you've been planning for a long time?
Well, the second question, so this educability notion, which I'll tell you in a second, is a composite of 3 components. And it's only recently, maybe about 3 years ago, that I realized some of the components I've worked on for a long time, but it's only recently I realized how to put the 3 together. So it's like a new result, which I wanted to publish, but it's taken several years. The publication process has taken several years, so the reason for publishing it was simply that I arrived at this understanding fairly recently, but this understanding, I think, it does have relevance to everyday events, and I was conscious of the fact that I didn't know when I was writing it what the world will be like when the book appeared, and indeed that's so. So anyway, so I wasn't trying to fit the book to the world in which it's going to appear, because the world changes too fast. Okay, so shall I tell you briefly about educability?
Yes, please.
Okay, so basically it's the composite of 3 components. The first component is learning from experience, learning by example. And this is, I identify exactly with this probably approximately correct learning. which is the paradigm which is used in machine learning. So the large language models like ChatGPT all basically purely learn from examples. It's given lots of text and it learns to predict the next syllable. Of course, the art is the training set on which it's trained. I mean, a lot of work goes into having a training set which gets you the effect you want. Okay, so learning from examples is one component. Second component is a simple kind of reasoning, which is chaining. So if you've learned several different things, you also want to be able to chain together your conclusions. So if I look outside the window, from one thing I've learned, I may be able to recognize a certain kind of tree, but from then I can apply something else I've learned to predict something else about the tree. So chaining together different things you may have learned at different times. So this is simple reasoning. And the third thing is being able to incorporate into all this mental infrastructure knowledge which you've got explicitly from others. So I don't have to learn directly from experience anymore. I can also just listen to you, and you tell me some generalization you've learned. Maybe tell me about some theory of physics or any conclusions you've reached in the world, and I can incorporate it in my mind and use it as if I had learned it myself from experience. And of course, this last aspect, which is the most human, that we can, if someone discovers something, they can tell 1,000 people the next day about it, and then they'll know it. So in other species, there's nothing like this. So the rapid evolution of science is based entirely on this fact that hard-won discoveries can be easily spread in a large population, so they can all try to make further advances. So this is roughly what educability is, the combination of these three aspects.
Thank you for explaining that. I think the book is really good, and I think you give some fantastic examples, because I started going down a rabbit hole and thinking, well, can't we train chimpanzees? Aren't chimpanzees similar? And then there was a story, I think it was of chimpanzees that escaped a zoo in Belfast. And then I started going down another rabbit hole about, obviously, chimpanzees don't communicate in the same way as us, but could we teach them sign language? And then I found that there was one that actually learned sign language. So it's really interesting. I think it's one of these topics that seems extremely logical when you read it, but has been a question mark for so long. Talking about the power of educability, you mentioned Johannes Kepler in the book, and that he achieved what he did through a combination of formal education, self-education, and that he essentially put himself in a position of being able to use what others before him had obtained with lifetimes of effort. So my question is, now that we all have access to an abundance of knowledge, why do you think there are less, not more, polymaths and breakthrough scientific progress in the world? Or do you think there is, and just not everyone knows about it?
Well, I think it's harder to be a polymath if there's so much diverse knowledge around. I mean, individual can only master so much. So in some sense, of course, the amount of new science being produced every day is much larger than it's ever been. There are more scientists alive than I don't quite know what the statistic is. So science is certainly benefiting from both the fact that we have this capability and from the fact that you can send information around the internet much faster than ever before. So science is certainly benefiting. I mean, if the criticism is that you don't think there are as many breakthroughs, but again, I'm not quite sure about that. I think as far as breakthroughs, you have to look at history and how people will look back on this period in 100 years' time. It's hard to judge breakthroughs, in real time. So I would say that 100% the being able to communicate faster is good for science. It's got very little downside for science.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the question I should have framed it a different way. I just wondered, because I think we don't maybe I might be talking out of turn. I feel that we don't highlight the breakthroughs as much. So when anyone, the average Joe on the street is reading the news, we might learn about some scientific progress, but we don't pay as much attention to that as something which is less exciting and more important. So I think because we have this abundance of information, we're actually not focusing on the right things. And lots of work, of course, is being done. And like you said, it's not in the here and now that we will take note of it or take stock of it. Someone you also mentioned in the book is Herbert Simon, pioneer in many modern day scientific domains such as AI, information processing, complex systems, and so on. I read this might seem as a random question, but bear with me. I read that at an early age, Simon learned he was colorblind and discovered the external world is not the same as the perceived world, which I thought was really interesting. And I wondered, was there a moment in your lifetime when you were younger where your belief systems might have changed, and how did that impact your work?
Well, not. I don't think I can point to anything quite so dramatic. I suppose he concluded that other people's perception of the world is different from his. But certainly, I'm sympathetic to his viewpoint in that clearly we see the world very much in terms of one's personal inner what I call mind's eye, where we project on our existing beliefs. So our perceptions of the world should be viewed as very personal, individual, and we shouldn't assume that our perceptions are the same as some external reality. So maybe I've slowly got to believe that more and more, that it's important to distinguish between our perceptions and what we think is objective reality. Of course, in science, we try to establish objective reality, but that's a difficult task. It works in some cases for science, but otherwise, I think we have to be more cautious in ascribing to the world what we perceive.
Absolutely. I wanted to actually touch back on cognition, which we've been talking about earlier. How would you say your work as a theoretical computer scientist has highlighted to you some important facts about human cognition?
Well, so it's the spirit of what I'm working on, as expressed in the book, is that I'm trying to characterize cognition in some simple way. And to do that, I have to, restrict what I'm asking about. So, for example, how I phrase what I'm doing is in terms of, what humans are capable of mentally and other species are not. So this is the extra thing we have as compared to apes, for example. So this is something which, in evolutionary terms, happened fairly fast. In evolutionary terms, a few million years. So maybe it's simple enough that we've got some chance of guessing it. So there are many aspects of our brains which are much more ancient in evolution. So certainly our perceptions of the world, physical movement, touch, vision, hearing. So these are things which we share with other animals, and they're very complicated. But one can try to separate out these issues from the purely cognitive things which humans developed different from other animals. So actually, Turing discussed this issue that what could you do with a disembodied computer which didn't have senses. And so, in some sense, I think that's a very good formulation, and in some sense, that's the kind of formulation which I'm trying to solve. So, I'm trying to have a description of cognition which doesn't contradict any known facts, but is simple enough to explain a lot. And so, I think the characteristics of educability, which I described, I think are the power behind our cognition. Let's say, I think that's how I would summarize the powerful aspects of our cognition. We're able to get information from the world and apply them and run with it.
There's so many fascinating paths that you take in the book, and I think it's a really great book for anyone to read. One thing I kept kind of returning to was this idea that in this current age that we live in now, there's never been a more important time to learn how to think critically. And I'm not sure it's something that obviously I haven't been in a school for a long time, but I don't necessarily know it's something that's taught at school. Just learning how to reason and think critically, I think is imperative. So I wanted to ask you, if you were to reimagine education, or if you were to take a class with children, how would you get them to think more critically about the world?
That's a great question. So, I do try to make a few remarks this is very important without saying exactly how it should be done. So the notion of critical thinking, that we should reason more carefully and not make errors in reasoning, I think is very important and should be pursued, and many people are pursuing it. But okay, so one realization I've made while writing this book is that may not be quite enough. That it's, for example, if people believe something different from you and you think what they believe is absurd, it's probably not that they've made some error in reasoning. It's hard to persuade someone that, oh yes, you're wrong because you made this error in your reasoning. So the differences usually come in earlier as far to do with fundamental beliefs. So the point is that I think through education, formal, informal, media, we acquire beliefs which are natural learning algorithms. So our natural learning algorithms are used to put these beliefs into our brains from our experiences. And so one problem is that we may arrive at very different beliefs if we've heard different stuff at school. And in these times when information is spread so fast on the internet, we're subject to all kinds of different beliefs. So I think the aspect of education which I think should be improved is that we should be somehow hardened against adopting beliefs just because we hear them. So I suppose my argument is that in most animals, when they learn, the world is in some sense neutral. The world isn't trying to wreck their learning. So for example, if an animal learns that a certain tree has a good fruit on it, and it's a good bet that this animal should return to the same tree, the fruit's going to be good. But now, I suppose they're propagandists and other people who are trying to change what we believe for their own interest. So the learning scenario in the world isn't totally neutral. It can be malevolent, and somehow, we should all be trained better into understanding that the information, that people who are telling us information may have some ulterior motive to tell us this information. So in some sense, we should be more suspicious, and we should better understand the motivations of people who give us information. So I think it would be very important to make education in schools encompass these aspects of not just critical thinking, of not making reasoning mistakes, but I think even more importantly, to evaluate carefully the information which we absorb. Normally in schools, we trust the teacher. We assume the teacher tells us the truth. And if we didn't, the whole education system wouldn't work. But we shouldn't trust everybody that they're telling us the truth.
Yeah, I think this is the difficulty that we're living in now, because in my generation, we grew up thinking that, there are certain bodies that were to be followed, the government, the teachers, the police. And I think there is a generation now that don't have the same respect, for whatever reason, for those bodies. We would get our daily newspaper, and, as long as you were reading a rather, I can't use the word intelligent, but a decent newspaper, you would expect that the news that you're reading is the truth. Whereas there's so many different incentives for journalists now. And like we said previously, that the news cycle is happening so fast as information spreads over the internet. So I think the whole the whole thing's skewed slightly, and it's even more important that we find the right people or right places to gain knowledge. Just another thing on that kind of education side, if we can't determine how to teach all people what is right and wrong or true or false, how do we educate computers?
Well, that's exactly it. That so this educability I describe, I think it describes cognition of humans, and then the question is, how much of this can you make a computer do? And I think essentially all of it, but some aspects of it are problematic both for humans and for computers. So the question of what beliefs a human should have and what's the best way of educating humans is an open question. It's a controversial question. So the same arises for computers, that we don't know of any optimal way of telling a computer whom to believe, with what information to accept. So I call this belief choice. So many psychologists do research on this kind of issue for humans, like children. Do they listen to their parents more than someone else? That kind of thing. So we all have some policies for belief choice, who we believe. And I suppose for humans it's kind of heuristic, and obviously it's not foolproof. And so if we give machines the same capabilities, then we have to make the same decisions, and the machines will have the same, probably faulty methods of deciding whom to believe.
Is this an area that you're excited about or worried about? Because, we hear a lot, I've seen a lot of interviews recently with, for instance, the founders of OpenAI, where, even the CTO was asked, "Oh, what models have your what data sets have your models been trained on? Are they YouTube videos?" And from what I could see, she wasn't able to answer, which I'm sure is more of a legal issue than she just doesn't know. But it does kind of worry me that sometimes if we're training models on what's currently available, it does concern me. But how do you feel? Is this something that you think can be fixed, as in how these models are trained, or not?
Well, I'm saying that it can be fixed in the same way that it can and cannot be fixed for machines, in the same way as it can and cannot be fixed for humans. So, humans suffer the same failures if they're taught nonsense. But okay, I think it's a very important question. But just going back to something you pointed out, so I think besides education, which I try to suggest, and the other area we need to work on is exactly what you pointed out, that at one point we had institutions which we trusted, there's now much less so. So I think we have to recreate institutions which are somehow trustworthy by their composition. So, for example, now, you can get a left-wing view or a right-wing view, depending on what website you go to. But really, we need to get some website where, say, both points of view are argued out. I think the only way of presenting information. So this would be a way in which we present information which would gather more trust by its composition. So we have an organization which promises to you to give both sides of the story when they're two recognized sides. So this is like creating new institutions which are more trusted. So I think that's an area, and I think we have to go down that route. Otherwise, things aren't good. Because I think we are just saying it another way. So I think our abilities to absorb information, learn information, relate information to what we already know, and all run with it are enormous. But our ability to judge what information is valid is very weak. And most of our civilization is based on trust. So certainly if you learn science at university, you sit there for 3 years, you listen to lots of lectures, and you have to trust the lecturer. You've got absolutely no way of verifying for yourself all the experiments described, for example. So we really have been brought up in the world of trust, and trust is essential for taking advantage of our educability, so we can keep learning more information. We need to trust what we hear. So in a world where trust isn't justified, our brains are very confused.
I think this is the age that we're living in. I think trust has been eroded for different reasons. And I think, alluding to what I was saying earlier, I think there is an element of the incentives have changed in many ways in different fields. And I think that, I even think about the pandemic. This is, maybe a bad analogy, but especially in the UK here, that during the pandemic, when Boris Johnson would do his announcements, and whether you think he was a good prime minister or not is slightly irrelevant. The point was we were dealing with something unprecedented, and he would do his announcements. I think they were, at one point very early on, they were daily. And you could hear, because it was so quiet, there were no aeroplanes, there was hardly any traffic, no one was going anywhere. You could hear through all the houses, the windows were open and people were all tuning in. And, it's probably wrong to say, but it felt like we were united. And then I would say that within 2 weeks, that all changed. And I don't know what happened. I don't know, as humans, if we're able to follow instructions as well as we used to. And I think there is a certain element of trust that has been eroded, and not necessarily for the right reasons, but obviously that's a whole different topic. A couple more questions that I've got for you is, you mentioned very early on when you talk about your childhood about these experiments that you'd tried and failed, essentially. And I think that makes a great scientist, someone that is not afraid to fail. And yet a lot of the time in schools, we're teaching children not to fail, that failing is wrong. So I wanted to ask you, how do we teach even your students that you have at Harvard? What is it about failure that we can teach them in order for them to overcome and understand that everything we do in research is about experimentation?
Well, I think it usually hits one, me included, and everyone else. So when you become a research student, it hits you immediately. You try to solve a problem and you waste a day, you can't, and then this goes on day after day, month after month. So this experience you don't have, say, when you're undergraduate, because then you sit there trustingly absorbing new information every day. So I think it's, maybe, I don't know what else one can do but expose people to the experience of them trying to solve a problem which no one knows the answer to, and they may not be able to succeed. So yeah, I mean, if you ask the question more generally, that people should embark on projects for which the success isn't guaranteed, and to be more ambitious in their choices. Yeah, but that's a difficult advice to give, because everyone has to make their own choices. Yes, I'm not sure whether there's a generic way of addressing this question.
I guess it's this view that we mustn't fear failure, and there are different types of failure, obviously. I've got 2 more questions for you. We want to create a more educable society, and I think your book is, obviously, being the person that has introduced the theory, a very relevant read. Are there some tips for people to become more educable?
So again, I don't know. I think this is the subject of future research. So, I mean, the question whether you can increase your educability or not is open. So these IQ tests you mentioned. So certainly, if you train on doing many IQ tests, then you can improve your performance, even if you don't look for the answers at the back. So most human endeavors, if you practice, you can improve. So with educability, one guesses that the same holds, but who knows? So I think this is more a question for the future. The question is whether we can make the whole education process somehow more effective by making people more educable. So if one could, that would be very good, clearly. And certainly, I think research should be done in that direction. But I wouldn't like to forecast the result of the research.
Where do you go from here in terms of the book? Is this something you're going to revisit at some point?
Well, I think some of the issues we've discussed, I think, are going to stay with me, I think. I mean, this last question of whether we can improve educability, I think, is a great question. Certainly, if I can persuade some psychologists to do experiments in that direction, that would be great. And also things we discussed just before of what we can do effectively to mitigate this problem, that we live in a world where there's more and more information which is not trustworthy, and how we should cope through education or other institutions, or making institutions which are more trustworthy. I think these are all issues which concern me, and I'll be very happy to collaborate with people on these. I probably couldn't do very much on any of these by myself.
Okay, last question, which I ask everyone, is obviously the life that you have led has been full of huge successes. You've won the Turing Award. You've had every wonderful accolade you can receive. I guess it's a 2-part question. One is, what are you most proud of in your career? And second part of the question is, if you could go back to a particularly difficult part of your career, what's one piece of advice you would offer yourself?
Well, I think so probably in some sense I've had a fairly easy life. So some of the decisions I made early on worked out, and so I think the main insight from that is probably the oldest one, is kind of the suggestion is know thyself. So I think in deciding which road to take at a fork, it's hard to predict the world, but you have some chance of knowing yourself. So finding something to do next which you think will suit you is kind of is the only advice I can pass on, which is knowing oneself. So yeah, I mean, as far as what one is proud of, so this field of computer science, when I started, was very young. There was some anxiety in people, including myself, that maybe it wasn't a great field, maybe nothing much would be discovered. But it turned out that it became a very rich field. Obviously, it's changing the world. So certainly, having been part of that, has been very exciting and rewarding.
I'm sure it has. Leslie, thank you so much for your time today. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Leslie Valiant. And thank you to Leslie for sharing his time and story. And a big thank you to whitebridge.ai for sponsoring this episode. If you want to get one of their reports, don't forget to head to whitebridge.ai and use my discount code Danielle30 for 30% off your first report. You can use the service to see what your digital footprint looks like online, including whether your emails have been part of any data breaches, or to get info on a potential client, employer, or investor. Just head to whitebridge.ai. Now, and as always, I want to leave you with a quote, and today's is, unsurprisingly, from Leslie's book, The Importance of Being Educable. In fact, it is the final paragraph, and it reads, "Educability is an information processing capability that humans have. It has enabled us to stand on each other's shoulders and build the edifice of beliefs that is our current civilization. Our power to generate new beliefs has few limits. The beliefs we adopt govern how we act and have consequences without end. One would hope that if educability is recognised to be the defining human capability, then the search for a deeper understanding of it would become a unifying quest. Surely we can direct our power of being educable at ourselves to better understand the nature of this power and set a steadier course."